Um, I guess that's it. We're ready to go ahead and get started. I'm happy to introduce Steve Wiegenstein as our speaker this evening. Steve grew up in the Ozarks, the setting for his novel series, and worked there as a newspaper reporter before entering the field of higher education. An avid hiker and canoeer, he returns to his home region every chance that he gets. He also writes and blogs about rural and Ozarks issues. He's been involved with the literature of the Ozarks since the late 1970s when he co-founded Ozark Review magazine. His academic degrees are in journalism and English, and he has taught both subjects at several colleges and universities. This wasn't in Steve's information on our website, but his short story collection, Scattered Lights Stories, was recently named as a finalist for the 2021 PEN Faulkner Award for Fiction. So Steve, congratulations on that honor and welcome. Thank you for being our guide to Ozarks literature this evening.
Thank you so much, Renee. I really appreciate the chance to be here and to visit with everyone. As my bio said, I've been interested in Ozark literature for many years now as a writer and as a observer. And so I have thoughts, as they say. I would like to share those with you. And coming from the Ozarks myself, I kind of perceive ebbing and flowing of interest and of creativity through the years. And my central thesis for this evening is that we're for the last few years, we've really been in a flowering of literature by and from and about the Ozarks, which may be, to some extent going undetected in the wider world, but I think it's there, and I think there's a lot of really great writing to be found. I want to talk about some of those, and my sort of core hope is that I will introduce you to some writers that you might want to check out and to see if you've got some interest in them. I do have a slideshow that I'll be sort of dipping into and out of as we go, so I'll kind of be coming and going here a little bit. But let me just put my first title slide up right now, so that I can show you something. Okay, that's my email address, steve@stevewiegenstein.com. And my website address there is stevewiegenstein.com. If you have something you'd like to talk about or to share with me after the program is over with, please feel free to contact me at my email address or visit my website and go from there. Because I love hearing from folks. And one thing that has always been the case is that whenever I do a program, I always end up learning things that I had no idea about before. So it's really kind of a fun two-way street for me. When you say the words Ozarks literature, to most people, I think, or to a lot of people anyway, this is what pops into their head, right? The Shepherd of the Hills, of course, the famous turn of the century novel by Harold Bell Wright that sort of set the tone for writing about the Ozarks and has, maintained its position as the probably the best known piece of writing that's ever come out of the Ozarks. If you talk about Ozarks literature, it may be that people might think of this one instead, right? Winter's Bone by Daniel Woodrell, the short novel that then became a movie, and hit it big and sort of envision the life of the Ozarks to the contemporary audience. And I would just kind of add here, Winter's Bone is a lovely book. If you only know the story from the movie, you should check out the book because it is different, and it gives a good flavor of Daniel Woodrell's writing. But he also has a lot of other books as well that are very much worth pursuing. But there's more, right? There's a lot more than just The Shepherd of the Hills and Winter's Bone. And that's kind of what I want to get into. In 2019, there were a couple of things, right about 2 years ago, there were a couple of things that happened that I think really reflected a more mature and kind of heightened understanding of the Ozarks as a region and as a place of cultural significance. One of those was the publication of the second volume of Brooks Blevins' History of the Ozarks. There is a third volume that's due out anytime now, pretty soon. And the first volume had come out earlier. But there has been, of course, geographies and histories of various things, but this 3-volume series is the first to really take a comprehensive look across all state lines, Missouri, Arkansas, and even Oklahoma, at the Ozarks as a unitary region, as a place of importance, and really to what you might say, take it seriously from a historical perspective in a big, comprehensive kind of way. So that's one of the things that happened in 2019 was that volume 2 of this series came out, and certainly is if you're interested in Ozarks history, it's something that belongs on your shelf. The other thing was the publication of this anthology, The Literature of the Ozarks. This came out from the University of Arkansas Press, edited by Phillip Howerton. And again, there have been anthologies of Ozarks writing before, right? Missouri University Press has published one, University of Arkansas Press published one, but they tended to be kind of snapshots of what's happening today. This is in contemporary writing kinds of things. This anthology is kind of different, excuse me, in that it takes, again, that kind of comprehensive, beginning to the present day approach, going all the way from schoolcraft in 1819 and even some earlier smidgens, all the way up to people who are writing today. And again, the sort of overall feeling is, gosh, here's somebody who really takes the Ozarks and writing about the Ozarks seriously from a critical standpoint. And each of the sections of the book has a long preface of critical examination and discussion. So it's suitable for classroom use. It's also suitable just for what I do, which is I have a copy and I dip into and out of it from time to time and just read something that catches my interest. So I think the publication of these two books kind of signals something to me. And in a way, it kind of has signaled to me that there is an audience for Ozark cultural studies in a sort of grand sense. And also that people writing about the Ozarks have achieved a kind of a level of critical self-examination that I think is important. Now, in Northwest Arkansas, of course, when you talk about the literature of the Ozarks, probably you think of Donald Harrington, right? And certainly in the contemporary landscape, Donald Harrington and Daniel Woodrell are sort of the twin peaks of writing about the Ozarks. Of course, I just put on the slideshow here my favorite book of Harrington's, which is Whiff. That's the one I like the best, although he obviously has more than a dozen others that are also quite delightful. Don Harrington died not long ago, but certainly left behind a great, tremendous body of work that is not as well known as it should be, in my opinion. But certainly, definitely a landmark figure in Northwest Arkansas, especially. Daniel Woodrell's book, Winter's Bone, and some of his other books, Tomato Red, for example, sort of set off a kind of subgenre, I guess, of writing based in the Ozarks, and that is the thriller genre. Right now, if you type Ozarks fiction into your search engines, you'll get a bunch of thrillers by a number of different authors, and you might have seen the Netflix TV series, which likewise involved murders, many murders, and crimes of all sorts. But it's kind of interesting, and I'm not a student of the thriller genre, but murders are, they're kind of part and parcel of writing about the Ozarks. It's not so much that you have them, as kind of what you do with them. One of the most interesting books of the last dozen years, I guess, that involves a murder to me is this one, which people are not as familiar with. It's by Katie Estel. It's called Die Is Gone. It's her second novel. And I'm sad to say she hasn't published anything since. I think this came out about 2007 or thereabouts. It's a lovely book, and it has a murder right at the beginning, and so when you think about books with murder, that's sort of, you go into it with this expectation. But what happens then is it's very unlike a lot of, it's not a thriller. We kind of know who did it pretty early, you sort of know. And it's much more driven by the characters of three women who are all connected to the victim in one way or another. The mother, the deputy sheriff who is investigating the crime, and then the neighbor who is kind of supposed to take care of the victim at the critical moment. And it's all about their interactions and their feelings and their responses. So although it's an Ozark story with a gruesome murder in it, it kind of thwarts the genre expectations of being, just a yarn with lots of blood and guts and killing and that sort of thing. And this whole idea of re-examining a genre is something that's popping up a lot these days in writing about the Ozarks. I'll mention another book that does that. This is Steve Yates's novel, The Legend of the Albino Fawn. And Steve grew up in Springfield, Missouri, went to school at Arkansas, and he draws on that landscape for most of what he writes. And I didn't know this, but in Springfield, there is a legend of the albino fawn. It was this farm on the north end of town where, supposedly this kind of creepy place where a family of albinos lived. And, it was sort of an urban legend kind of thing. But what he does in this novel is he takes that idea, let's say there's this urban legend about, this weird location, and instead of treating it as horror, and there actually was a horror movie created out of this legend. Let's look at it from the perspective of the family who lives there, who has people driving up their driveway all the time, who has people creeping out into their yard at night, trying to see the albinos, the mythical albinos who live there, and basically drives them crazy. So again, it's taking something that might have been dealt with in a conventional way and flipping it, kind of the same way that Values Gone does with the murder genre. Right? This is Steve Yates, currently lives in Mississippi, and works down there, but he writes out of the Ozarks, and of particular interest to you all in Fayetteville is this short novella by Steve called Sandy and Wayne, which actually grew out of his time as a student at the University of Arkansas, because during the summers he worked for the highway department. And this is a short novel. It's a bittersweet, very tender love story that takes place among the highway crew, as they're working on a job. It's the most sort of unexpected location that you would put a really touching love story. But there were, those of you who lived in Northwest Arkansas a long time can remember what happened, when Highway 71 was transmuted into its current glorious interstate condition. There's a lot of construction went on back during those years. You can envision this story taking place at one of those construction sites as the highway was being built. I'm talking about fiction right now, but there's a lot of other kinds of writing that are coming out of the Ozarks that I'll get to in a minute. I did want to start with fiction because to me that's where a lot of creative effort is happening, and I really can't talk about all of the really good pieces of work that have come out of this region. I'll mention a few, and one of the genres that is really getting interesting is short fiction. And I'll mention a couple of books of short stories that I think are just marvelous. C.D. Albin, Craig Albin, lives in West Plains, Missouri, is both a poet and a fiction writer. And his collection of stories called Hard Toward Home is really just masterful story writing. About half of the stories are set in northern Arkansas, which I believe is where his family roots are, and the other half are set in southern Missouri. So it's kind of a universal kind of set of stories, but they're really worth looking into. And then the other one is Down Along the Piney by John Mort. This was published by the University of Notre Dame Press a year ago. And its subtitle is Ozark Stories. And most of these are set, I won't say in the Ozarks necessarily, but they have Ozarkers in them. And which is, to me, is part of the interesting thing is that several of these stories involve expatriate Ozarkers who are living in Chicago or Florida or Texas or someplace like that. And, the cultural imprint of their upbringing sticks with them, and they're always pulled back home, for reasons they can't necessarily explain. Again, it is a lovely collection of stories. Probably my favorite is one called Mariposas, which is the Spanish word for butterfly. And the reason I like that story is that it involves a young Hispanic girl who's in her early mid-teens, whose family has come up to work in a chicken farm, or a chicken factory, I should say, and she thinks of herself as an Ozark. Now, breaking that kind of cultural stereotype of what an Ozarker is and what an Ozarker should look like is to me a really significant thing, that we're having to redefine ourselves in the face of changing cultural conditions, and I think that's particularly worth pointing out. In the story, her family has to go back to Mexico for a time when times get hard, and of course, she's now down in Mexico, and she feels a longing to get back to the Ozarks, which she thinks of as her home. And she regards the people she's among as hillbillies, and scorns these hillbillies that she's having to deal with, and wants to go back to Arkansas. And such a marvelous turn. And I will say, it would be remiss of me not to plug my own book, which and thank you, Renee, for mentioning, but it just came out in November, and has been received very, very well. And I'm really thrilled by that. So I will count myself in as among some of these short story writers that are working very hard to put some definition into our cultural landscape. But I will say some of these other folks are darn good, just as good as I am. So I don't want to praise myself any more than that. One other piece of fiction I do want to mention is this really interesting book. It's called The Ozark Trilogy, and it's by Suzette Hayden Elgin, who is not an Ozarks native, but she retired to, I think it was Springdale, maybe, or I can't remember exactly where it was, but she retired to Northwest Arkansas. She was most famous, she's passed away now, but she was most famous for, she was a linguist. And a book she wrote back in the 70s, I believe, called The Gentle Art of Verbal Self-Defense, which was a massive bestseller. You probably will have seen it on the used book stand, and it spun off into, dozens and dozens of spin-off books. The Gentle Art of Verbal Self-Defense at the Workplace, or The Gentle Art of Verbal Self-Defense in the Marriage, and on and on and on. But she was also a very accomplished poet and writer of science fiction. And the Ozarks trilogy is sci-fi. Now, you don't associate the Ozarks with sci-fi very much. I mean, I don't anyway. It seems incongruous, but this is a very interesting book because it takes place on a distant planet. And the premise, which is not really spelled out to any great extent, the premise is that, Earth has poisoned itself with pollution and that sort of thing. And so they've had to flee to other planets. And this particular group has landed on a planet and colonized it, but they're all from, sort of the central United States. And so they've brought with them their certain kinds of habits and ways of speaking and things like that. So it's like the Ozarks, except it's taking place in a galaxy far, far away. And so if you're a fan of science fiction, you should look into this. But I will tell you, it's not at all like traditional sci-fi in the sense of spaceships and laser cannons and that sort of thing. The people ride mules, now the mules can fly. But so it's kind of, it's really quite got a lot of interesting twists, but it's well worth looking. This is Suzette Hayden Elgin. She passed away about 8 or 10 years ago, I guess. But she left behind the Ozark trilogy, which is, to my knowledge anyway, the most significant of the fiction, of science fiction that has an Ozark setting. So I thought I'd at least mention that for a minute. Before I go on and look at other forms of writing, I will say, that there is just a great deal of good writing that's going on in and about the Ozarks. And in all honesty, I think one of the reasons for that is what I showed you at the beginning, in the sense that people are becoming aware that this is a region that has literary value. That's not just a place where you can safely traffic in stereotypes. And I suppose you can get away with that with certain audiences, but there is an audience for writing from and about the Ozarks that goes into some broader questions, more searching kinds of issues, and is willing to take risks, which is, in my mind, really a valuable thing. Now, let me just mention a couple of other areas of writing. Nonfiction. Okay, I'll move on to nonfiction here for a minute. Two things you see a lot of in nonfiction writing are memoir writing and nature writing. Now this one is not new, but if you haven't run across this book yet, it's worth going back and finding. Most libraries keep a copy on their shelf, even though it's from 1970 something, I think. A Country Year, Living the Questions, by Sue Hubbell. She was an Easterner who came to the Ozarks with her husband. They bought, a tract of crappy land out in the woods, back to the land, that movement. Things did not work out. The husband left, and she was on her own to try to make a go of it out in Shannon County, Missouri, which is about as rough could get. But she was also an extremely accomplished writer. She wrote columns for the St. Louis newspaper and for national magazines, things like that. So she was able to kind of capture her experience in a really meaningful way. And this is it's both a memoir and a piece of nature writing, really, kind of intertwined, and also social observation of her difficult year, trying to stay alive, with very little means of support. As a way of making money, she turned to beekeeping, and there are significant passages in the book of her trucking these bees from one place to another, and tending the honey and selling the honey at the local market and all those kinds of things. So Sue Hubbell is no longer with us. I'm sad to report. But she also, besides A Country Year, she also wrote a book called A Book of Bees, which is very, deep down, careful observation of the lives of bees, from a naturalist's perspective. A lot of people compare her work to Annie Dillard, if you're looking for points of comparison of that kind of nature writing. A recent book that came out that I found very enjoyable is Ozark RFD, and this is this is memoir writing of a sort. Jim Hamilton, who is the author of that book, was a country editor, a newspaper editor north of Springfield for 40 plus years. And as the country editor, he wrote a column every week. And these are shaped versions of some of his columns. And one of his favorite topics was the past and reminiscences. Now, we all know that everybody's got a book of, when I was a kid growing up in the hills, and there are lots of those around. But Jim Hamilton's, I think, stands out from the sort of run of that particular mill, and that he's very, he can be nostalgic. He can also be pretty searching about the good and the bad of life as it was when he was a kid growing up, milking cattle and all of that went with it. So it's a book of columns that have been kind of transmuted, I suppose. Finally, I want to talk about poetry. And poetry of and about the Ozarks is probably the hardest thing to find because, it's the nature of poems that they get published one at a time. And so if you're interested in poetry, you have to do a good bit of hunting. Now, it is our good fortune, however, that there are some journals that come out of the Ozarks that are great places to begin. One is Cave Region Review, which is published from Northern Arkansas College. It's both literary and visual art. They always have visual art as well, but it's a great place to go hunting for poems. And the other is Elder Mountain. Elder Mountain comes out of the Missouri State University campus at West Plains. So if you like poetry, these are good places to dip in and look for writers that you respond to. The enjoyment of poetry is probably the most subjective thing of all. But there have been and still are some really marvelous poets working, not necessarily in the Ozarks, but around the Ozarks, from the Ozarks. I just want to mention a few. C.D. Wright, who was from Fayetteville, lived in Fayetteville, but then moved away, and was not an Ozark resident for a long time. Is a great starting place if you're looking for poetry that has an Ozarks flavor. This is her last book before she died. I believe it's her last book, Steal Away. There in Fayetteville, of course, was Miller Williams, and he's kind of Miller Williams is kind of a test case for definitions because he didn't really write about the Ozarks much. Right? He wasn't from the Ozarks; he was from Hoxie, as I recall. But of course, he lived in Fayetteville for years and years and years, and his poetic subject was not local so much. It was he wrote about anything that came to his mind. So you have to ask yourself, was he an Ozarks poet? He didn't do a lot of searching poetry about the Ozarks the way that some of these other folks do. Well, he lived in the Ozarks for a great portion of his life, so I think we can count him, even if he didn't really take it up as his prime subject. That was a collection of his poems that came out shortly before. I think actually that was published posthumously now that I think about it. One who is still alive, though, and is worth checking out is Patty Ann Rogers, who is from Joplin. And she's a poet we talk about nature poets, and she's certainly, excuse me, a nature poet in any sense of the word. But she has a very interesting kind of detached scientific voice that to me makes her stand out from other poets. I thought I'd just read you a poem since we're looking at poems. We can, I can't read long stretches of prose, but certainly I could do that with a poem or two. I thought I'd read you a poem by Patty Ann Rogers just to give you a flavor of her work. This is a poem that's called The Greatest Grandeur. And it goes like this. Some say it's in the reptilian dance of the purple-tongued sand goanna, for there the magnificent translation of tenacity into bone and grace occurs. And some declare it to be an expansive desert, solid rust-orange rock like dusk captured on earth in stone, simply for the perfect contrast it provides to the blue-gray ridge of rain in the distant hills. Some claim the harmonics of shifting electron rings to be the most rare, and some the complex motion of 7 sandpipers bisecting the arcs and pitches of come and retreat over the mounting hayfield. Others, for grandeur, choose the terror of lightning peals on prairies, or the tall collapsing cathedrals of stormy seas, because there they feel dwarfed and appropriately helpless. Others select the serenity of that ceiling cellar of stars they see at night on placid lakes, because there they feel assured and universally magnanimous. But it is the dark emptiness contained in every next moment that seems to me the most singularly glorious gift. That void which one is free to fill with processions of men bearing burning cedar knots, or with parades of blue horses, belled and ribboned and stepping sideways, with tumbling white-faced mimes, or companies of black-robed choristers. To fill simply with hammered silver teapots, or kiln-dried crockery, tangerine and almond custards, polonaises, polkas, whittling sticks, wailing walls, that space large enough to hold all invented blasphemies and pieties, 10,000 definitions of God and more, never filled, never. As you can see, she's a very complex poet, as well as one who's a really close observer of the physical world as well. So I have to say, I was just recently introduced to Patty Ann Rogers' work, and now I just keep reading it. I can't get enough of it. She lives currently in Colorado, and has for quite some time, I gather. Another few poets, so just to mention one, Karen Craigo. If you're not familiar with her, she's currently the Missouri Poet Laureate. Missouri has a Poet Laureate position, and she lived in Springfield. Very, very witty poet. We don't associate poems or poets with wit necessarily very much, but her poetry is often kind of funny. She takes things with kind of a slant, and this is her most recent collection, Passing Through Humansville. You may not be aware of this, but there really is a town in Missouri called Humansville. It's on Highway 54. So if you're going from like the Lake of the Ozarks west out into Kansas, you would maybe you wouldn't go through Humansville, but you would see the turnoff to Humansville anyway. Of course, that's kind of an idea of how she plays with that word. There's a book that was recently out last year, I believe, called Follow, by a poet named Amy Wright Vollmar, who is also from Springfield, Missouri. She's also a nature poet in a more kind of, I don't want to say romantic, but yeah, I guess romantic way. It's, instead of being sort of observational, and although she's a very close observer, she's also a very loving observer, so there's a great deal of love of nature in her poems as well. Phillip Howerton, this is Amy Wright Vollmar. Phillip Howerton, who you saw as the editor of the literature of the Ozarks, also is a poet. He published a collection called The History of Tree Roots, which is a title I just love, and you can sort of understand it when you look at the photograph there, that tree roots, even when they're dead or when they've been washed out, they carry their history with them, and you can see the whole, the passage of time in the shape of the tree roots. I thought that was a very lovely metaphor that he uses in one of his poems. Phil Howerton lives in West Plains, and so does Dave Malone. There's kind of a little literary community down there. Dave Malone is he's also a poet who writes about the past, in sometimes a kind of nostalgic way, but also scrutinizing his upbringing, his childhood. There's often a kind of erotic note in his poetry as well. This is me and Dave at a conference. I see Dave once or twice a year. He's a very lovely poet, very careful poet. Finally, I'll mention Carolyn Miller, who grew up. She grew up sort of in the general vicinity of Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, there in that Pulaski County area, on the Ruby Creek, as it's known. But she's lived in San Francisco for many years. But this particular collection, Route 66 and Its Sorrows, number one, I love the title, right? It's what a great title. But she does about a third of this book is remembrance of her childhood in the Ozarks. I thought I'd just finish my presentation with a poem from Carolyn Miller's book. This one is called 1000, 2000. When a storm sweeps over the far side of the valley above the airport signal tower, I would run into the yard to dance as the light went green and the clouds swelled and grew darker, filling the sky with their boiling masses. And I whirled on the grass beneath the walnut trees and their flying leaves. And when the black sky was split by lightning above the river valley and the ruby dew and the cows heading home, I stopped and counted 1000, 2000 before the thunder sounded to see how far away the lightning was. And when the first drops of rain splattered on the grass, I ran through it, leaping while Sparky hid in the garage. For I knew nothing about danger, about balls of fire that could enter a house or a body, or how the world could suddenly go wrong, or death race over the landscape, riding the ridges and jumping the hollers. And I ran in circles in the downpour until the storm passed off to the east over the drenched and steaming hills. That's a nice poem. I like that poem, 1000, 2000. Let me just finish by reminding you, this is my email address and my website. I invite you to give me a shout sometime or pass things along that you think I should have read or I should have mentioned. I'm always glad to hear more or to read more than what I've currently got. So let me just pause there and go on to uh, comments or observations folks would like. Renee, would you have
Yeah,
some things to?
thank you. Thank you for reading some poetry for us too. I appreciate that. I enjoyed those. I do have a question in the chat, and it's on the topic of poetry. It's from Nancy, and her question is: if you include Miller Williams as an Ozark poet, what would you do with poet Joe Mcdougall?
You know, I'm going to have to go read Joe Mcdougall in the first place because I don't I don't know her work. Um, so I'm embarrassed to admit I don't know what I would do.
Uh,
Could you tell me about Joe Mcdougall?
well, I think, and Nancy, if you want to unmute, go ahead. But was she not the poet laureate for Arkansas?
Yes, she
Yeah.
was. She's Arkansas born and bred. And most of her poems, she worked at the University of Arkansas for a while in the College of Agriculture, but most of her poetry is set in the rice growing area of Arkansas.
Mhm.
But she's moved back and forth between that flat land and the mountains.
Yeah. I
So
remember her now. Now, you know, the name just had escaped me. I remember reading some of her work.
she's certainly
Sure.
worth she's
Yeah.
certainly worth picking up, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of, you know, that's the great challenge. And in fact, people do the same thing with the Ozarks themselves because nobody can really definitively declare what the boundaries are. You know, Brooks Blevins, the historian, tells me told me a funny story once about how he was driving around up in Missouri, and he stopped at a gas station and asked the guy, I said, "Is this the Ozarks?" And the guy said, "Oh no, the Ozarks are over there." There, 20, you go down the road about 20 miles and you get to the Ozarks. And so it's one of those things where, and he finally, because he was trying to come up with a working definition. And his definition was, if you say it's the Ozarks, then it is. That it's like anyone who declares themselves to be of the Ozarks must be one, so it's kind of, in some ways that's sort of ducking the question, but I guess it works.
Oh, thank you. I have another question for you, Steve. This is from Pamela. What do you think caused this literary renaissance recently?
I've been thinking about that and sort of mulling it over, and I, as I mentioned, the kind of the publications, sort of anthologies and comprehensive histories, to me is a sort of a sign of something. It's not a cause. It's kind of an indicator that there's a level of cultural awareness and understanding that is that has been reached. And I think back a generation, and when you look back, say a generation, I think people were tend to be really defensive about being from the Ozarks or living in the Ozarks. It was Beverly hillbillies kind of mentality. And as a result, if you wrote something that was critical or searching or complicated, you might be, some people might have seen you as a kind of a traitor to your land. It's like, you don't want to say anything bad because there are plenty of people saying bad things out there. And that's not really the kind of brew pot for literary endeavor that's going to generate much. Now I think we've kind of passed out of that, where it's okay to be critical. It's okay to be, searching about our weaknesses. You don't have to boost the Ozarks in your writing or portray it as a sort of romantic, idyllic location. So I think maybe that's part of it. Also, I don't know, just, I think we are going through a period of cultural interest in the larger world, partly from movies and TV shows. And of course, anytime that happens, well, there's a market, and so now that there's a market, people sort of feel drawn to it in some ways where maybe they would have tried to write about something else if they didn't perceive there to be an audience for it. It's hard to say, really.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Speaking of the, just the region and the landscape, I like books where the setting itself, is an actual, seems like a character in the book as well. And the Ozarks seems like, it would be a perfect place to have it, treated as such. Can you speak to that a little bit? Either some writers or examples and some books that use that in the writing?
Yeah, to me, what is so interesting about the Ozarks as a setting and as a landscape is that let's face it, when you compare it with the Rockies, it's not all that grand, right? We don't do grandeur in that sort of, overwhelming kind of sense. The beauty of the location is experienced on the small scale. And it rewards close observation. It's the kind of landscape that a writer like Amy Vollmar, and I mentioned her book of poems follow. She does that just as good as anybody, where she pays really close attention to the little things. And so it rewards us a particular kind of observation, I think. And it doesn't overwhelm you. It's not like novels of the sea or something where these titanic forces are at work in the world. But it's kind of a human scale of grandeur. There's plenty of things I think that are quite grand to see and to experience in the Ozarks. But they're grand, in a different kind of way than Mount Everest is, and that sort of thing. Certainly the water, one of the things that you see when you read about the Ozarks, water plays a big role in that. I didn't mention him in my presentation, but there's a writer named Todd Parnell who's written 4 or 5 novels, and he's kind of an eco-activist in Northwest Arkansas and Southwest Missouri. I believe he lives in Springfield, but he works and writes a lot about Bull Shoals and Table Rock and that kind of area, and he's very, very interested in the water resource, and so that penetrates. His probably his best known book is one called Pig Farm, and you can kind of guess what that book is about. It's about the coming of a gigantic hog operation to a landscape that can't possibly support it, and what happens as a result. So if there's a key element to our experience of landscape, I think the water has to be in there.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. Yeah, and I can see that too, kind of on that smaller, more personal, intimate scale versus the, like you said, the wide open sea.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Right. I've been wanting to write something, an article or something that takes up the float trip as the sort of essential Ozark experience, because it occurred to me the other day I was looking at my bookshelf, and there are three books that I was looking at. One was Three Ozark Streams by Ward Dorrance. It's a book from the 1930s and involves him taking a float trip. And then Stars Upstream by Leonard Hall, which was published in the late 1950s. And then a book called The Drowned Boy by Art Homer, which was published 1990, mid-1990s, something like that. And it suddenly struck me, they're all describing exactly the same stretch of river. You know, they're all going down the exact same stretch of river. It's just their generation apart, you know. And I thought I should write something about that, but I haven't got around to it. You know, how there's nothing quite as Ozark as a float trip. You know.
So yeah, it's time. You've got the 30s, the 50s, the 90s. So now that it's time to pick that story up again. What was that second book that you mentioned of those three? You just
Stars Upstream.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Leonard Hall's book. He was a columnist for the Globe Democrat newspaper in St. Louis, and he was a big leader of the movement to create the Ozark National Scenic Riverways. He was one of the sort of movers and shakers behind that effort. And of course, like many people from St. Louis, of course, he thought he knew better than people who lived there. So if you go over toward the Ozark National Scenic River, you'll still find some people who are kind of resentful about that, you know, because the government did come in, you know, bought up, claimed a lot of people's farmland and, you know, kicked them off and that sort of thing. So it's not a universally admired effort by any means. The first book about float trip was Three Ozark Streams by the man's name was Ward Dorrance. He went by W.A. when he wrote that book. And that's it's a very poetic, lovely book. Black River, Current River, and Jack's Fork were the three Ozark streams that he went down. And of course, he went down the Black River before there was a dam on the Black River. So, you know, his experience of that is not, it can't be duplicated anymore.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for everything, Steve. I really appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure.
Any other questions or comments before we wrap up for this evening?
I found it very interesting and informative, and I was pleased to see, Steve, that you took pleasure in the things you wrote or read, and the things that you have on your fiction list here.
Well, thank you.
You took great pleasure, it seemed.
It's an endless source of pleasure, and that's why do it otherwise?
Yeah.
Thank you, Nancy. I appreciate that.
Well, thank you, Steve, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening for this terrific program. And with that, we'll let everybody go, and glad to see you. And thank you again, Steve. Everyone have a great night. Okay,
Bye-bye.
goodbye.